just to begin then, just a run through of what I'll be talking about. I'll provide a brief introduction, which just explains what do we mean by political and security risk, and a little insight into what I do. Then walk you through the case studies, as Gerhard explained, which will allow me to dive a little deeper and for you to see how my role in intelligence sort of works, and also make some predictions and give you some insight into those risks and opportunities he discussed. And then lastly, just a wrap up and some questions as discussed. So in terms of political and security risk, what do we mean? In very simple terms, I look alongside my colleagues at the domestic and regional and global trends in politics. So you may start with just the focus on one country. You may look at a region or across the globe. In terms of what we would look at in terms of developments, a classic example would be in the political sphere, an election or a change of leadership. What does that mean for policy continuity or change? That's in a very vague sense. So then foreign policy as well. So we don't just consider the impact of domestic policies, but also how actions internationally can rebound on countries. And in terms of security, what we're looking at there much more straightforwardly is the threat from state as well as non-state actors. So that could be anything from direct conflicts through to terrorism, through to mass movement protests, which we'll come on to discuss. And the aim, very simply, in what we're doing is to try to make some very clear predictions that will be either over the short term, what's happening in the next few days, next few weeks, looking to a monthly and even a multi-year horizon. The way this is used by business varies, can feed into teams. Classically, corporate security and travel risk within multinationals will take this, but also has important value for people looking at market entry. Is this a place to go? And also relevant for yourselves. We try to consider the wider investment environment. Are governments encouraging this? Not. What are the reputational, corruption, other risks you may face getting involved in a country? And so that, in a nutshell, is what we do. And then there's sort of two brands or two sort of streams in that: country risk, which is taking country X as a model, looking at recent developments and considering things within that confine. But then also a wider thematic reporting, which we'll get onto environment as an example. Try to take a more sort of holistic view, as it were, and look at the kind of underlying trends that can have greater reverberations within individual countries. So in terms then of the case studies, first one, which again I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of you, US-China competition and particularly trade. What we've seen since President Trump was elected was a real focus through the America First kind of policy, looking at whether or not America is getting a good and fair deal in its commercial relations with other countries. And this also speaks to a trend before Trump, under the Obama administration, the so-called pivot to China, which, although more a security based sort of strategy, fits into this. The US increasingly looking east and trying to deal with the growth of China as a rival. For the purposes of this case study, what we're really considering is Trump's focus on unfair trade surpluses, and the idea that the US is not getting a fair deal, with China obviously having a very large surplus with the US. That's obviously made it a key focus for Trump. It also speaks to a wider shift under the Trump administration away from the multilateral model of trade. He's taken a number of steps, including refusal to nominate judges to the WTO, which and an increased focus on trying to do deals bilaterally with countries. So that's where things stand in terms of the background. Pressure from Trump has had some success in terms of bringing China to the table. So we have the much touted Phase 1 deal, which saw the US cancel the introduction of about 160 billion of tariffs and roll back a number more. China on its side has also taken steps to reduce some tariffs. I think it was earlier this week was the latest rollback after some on the 1st of January. But perhaps more interestingly is promises by China to open up their markets to allow greater US access, and also a stated commitment to increase massively their purchases of US agricultural products, which again is aimed towards readdressing that trade balance. And from Trump's point of view, that's obviously got significant ramifications for his re-election prospects, as being seen to support the US farming industry, in some of these swing states. That's obviously a very key goal for him to be able to show he's delivering on that. So it leads on to the trajectory. Well, the blunt thing to say is slowing down in tariffs can only be a good thing. And I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will have seen positive-ish forecasts from the World Bank and the IMF at the beginning of the year, saying whilst growth will be sluggish, there is still at least a narrow uptick in predictions for growth for the coming year. However, I'd suggest optimism about a wider trade deal, something more comprehensive, seems premature. There are a number of flashpoints in the political sphere, say particularly US anger over industrial espionage on behalf of China. You may have seen in the news a Harvard professor whose name I forget off the top of my head, but a nanotechnology expert who had he'd been involved in effectively failing to declare he was being funded by Chinese research institutes, suggesting that he'd been handing over information. So that's a major tension. Also, in terms of the strategic sphere, tensions around the South China Sea, as well as US criticism over the rollback of democracy in Hong Kong, presents a lot of ways in which there's a lot of issues and a lot that can potentially derail progress, and indeed cause perhaps a rollback. Coronavirus provides an interesting kind of X factor in all of this, because how can China, when it's shutting down factories and its own demand is slumping, suddenly drive a massive increase in imports from the US to satisfy this deal? The US approach so far has been pretty conciliatory, which is good. However, I think that there's storm clouds on the horizon. Should China fail to be able to follow through on this, and the election approaches, Trump will likely need to be seen to be doing something. And so I'd say that the tariff risk has by no means been eliminated. And the question then really on the coronavirus is, are we seeing the peak? If we are, then it's not going to be too much of an issue. If we're not and it rumbles on, then it could become a significant complicating factor. And that'll be one that I'm sure you will all be interested in monitoring anyway, but has particularly odd ramifications here, I think. And in terms then of the takeaway, what to say, I think mainly, as I've said there, to reiterate, these trade tensions aren't going anywhere, even though things seem to have got a little bit better. Beware the false dawn on that front. I think as well, in terms of US monetary policy, something that we look at, I think Trump's desire and need to keep the stock markets up at its record highs means that you'll see, in line with all of this, particularly if there's chillings in trade as a result of the coronavirus that impacts the US, more downward pressure on the Fed to cut, which I think more chat about negative rates, although that won't happen. I think a lot more talk about that will probably flow from Trump. And then I think, look, that's, to sum up how I would see things in 2020, I think beyond that, obviously if Trump secures re-election, well, pressure on China will only continue. But even if it's a Democrat victory, with Bernie Sanders perhaps appearing most likely to secure the Democrat nomination at present, his China policy I don't see being massively different. He's spoken out a bit more against tariffs, but his desire to protect the US worker means that I don't necessarily see that there's a way forward to a sort of significant détente with China over these issues. So this will rumble on and on. So that's our first case study. shifting on then to the situation in the MENA region. Again, I'm sure you will all have memories of the Arab Spring. Just to recap, that's how that started in Tunisia when fruit seller Mohamed Bouazizi, tired of pressure from police and state oppression, and I think a need for him to get some extra meaningless permit, drove him to frustration and set himself alight, which sparked off huge ramifications across the region, seeing the downfall of a lot of well-entrenched leaders, so Ben Ali himself in Tunisia, but Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak in Egypt. And although those initial protests faded around sort of mid-2012, we still live very much with the consequences now. If you consider the instability contributing to the rise of Islamic State, the Syrian conflict, conflict in Yemen, conflict in Libya, it's still very much influencing the present. For this case study, I'm focusing more on a more recent outbreak. So 2019 saw a renewed spread of protests in the region. Started really in February in Algeria, but then spread through in October, particularly Lebanon and Iraq erupted, and Iran has seen a number of intermittent waves, which have been suppressed, at least temporarily, before resuming. I think perhaps the most important thing to flag up here is, from my vantage as more focused on the MENA region, is a tendency to essentialize what happens in these countries and to treat them as homogenous. And I think that there's a message here always to take care to avoid that. In the Lebanese context, it really speaks to a sort of frustration about the sectarian government political structure, which is something that's well established there, but isn't necessarily a feature of other countries. That's a facet of its unique constitution in that sense. In the Iraqi context, a lot of the anger there is fueled by Iranian influence and expansion, which is a big feature of recent years. Iran has spread its influence significantly. And I think as well in Iraq, also the end of the Islamic State threat has, to a certain extent, meant that people have been perhaps a little bit more, I say end, of course, that threat. That obviously is a little premature, but the territorial defeat of Islamic State has, I think, opened up a bit of a space where people are more willing to protest. In the Iranian context, obviously, US sanctions, particularly on the oil industry, are the key driver there. But then in Algeria, by contrast, there really is a very strongly political undercurrent there, where people are frustrated at the idea of President Bouteflika, who is very old and very infirm, standing for a fifth term, and elites have been unable to deal with the fallout from that. With that caveat, there are, however, interesting common threads. I think probably the key thing is demography. So these countries largely experiencing a youth bulge, a very large youth population, globally connected, but increasingly feeling that they're denied, not just political freedoms, but I think very significantly, access to jobs. And it's something that these states have really been unable to provide these opportunities, and I think that has given, to a certain extent, a sense among a lot of the youth that what have we got to lose, almost. There's some interesting other factors to think about with these is, firstly, that a lot of them erupted outside of traditional opposition structures, so they weren't established opposition parties that are leading this. They're very independent movements, social media obviously playing an important role. And so there's not necessarily a clear person to speak to negotiate on behalf of everybody. And also, I think it's a slight contrast with the previous Arab Spring that the downfall of dictators and leaders doesn't seem to be satisfying people. So we've seen some important resignations. Saad Hariri stepping down in Lebanon. Algeria, obviously, the president Bouteflika was forced to resign, as not stand for re-election, I should say. But that hasn't been enough to quell things. There's a deeper desire for change, which is not being met. in terms of the trajectory, the real worry is that at some point there'll be a rush towards violent suppression. I don't see that happening anytime particularly soon, as these are crises of legitimacy. It's not necessarily a very helpful way to try to end and stem this. Obviously, in Iran would be the outlier, where state structures are perhaps a bit more capable of achieving this, and also better entrenched. I think also been a real failure by elites to try to co-opt a lot of these opposition groups. So Algeria, a sort of national dialogue was attempted, but nobody bought into it because it was transparently an effort by elites to stitch things up. And I think as well the fact that elites are digging in. So a good example would be Lebanon, where we have a new government now dominated by Hezbollah that isn't, the technocratic administration that was perhaps desired. And that means that a lot of those economic concerns just won't go addressed. So, it seems that instead of pushing out these entrenched groups so far as a failure, that they're just digging their heels in. So where does this go? I mean, I think really in the foreseeable future, these will just roll on, that there's a sort of stalemate and it's difficult to see a way out. And I think even if there is an end, that's achieved and states manage to calm these things down, the big problem you have is that the underlying grievances aren't going away. So I think in terms of the key business takeaway, what I would say to people in the region is going to remain security-wise very difficult. I think there's a lot of risk of things seeming they're calming down temporarily, but then reigniting. And so exit strategies and constant monitoring, I think, becomes very important in these markets. And I think as well on the economic front, it just seems to me that there will, the failures to address the underlying issues will continue. I think acutely Lebanon would be an example where it becomes more difficult by the day to see how a default can be avoided on their sovereign debt. And one of the real sticking points is that looking across the region to the Gulf, typically, countries like Saudi Arabia particularly would have, wealth and resources to help bail a lot of these countries out as an exchange, help out and expand their influence. But obviously, as those oil states are going through their own economic turmoil following the price shock in mid-2014, there's not a lot of ammunition. And so the possibility of those kind of, bailouts, I think, has receded. So in the end, yes, I think to remain contested, and I think a trend, of instability and certainly recurring protests to continue well beyond the current year, as long as these issues remain unmet. Lastly, onto the environmental concerns. So again, we all will have seen the increased media focus. I mean, particularly Greta Thunberg and her immensely successful school strike movement and the actions of Extinction Rebellion, increase of direct action. I think sometimes what's missed in this story is that it's not just globally a bottom-up civil society pressure, but also there's increasing influence from the top, as it were, as a result of improved green performance in elections. I think Germany would be a particularly interesting example, where everyone talks relentlessly about the rise of AfD and populism, but everyone seems to quietly ignore the fact that Green Party's vote shares are rising hugely. The European Parliament, similarly, Green Party's becoming an increasingly important bloc. And as well as that, even if their Green Party is not directly successful, an indirect influence on major parties. Obviously, the US Democrats, the younger members, typified by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and drive for the Green New Deal. This is something that is becoming more mainstream within these parties. And those who followed the last UK election, if you read the manifestos, particularly the Labour Party, was hugely stealing the clothes, so to speak, of these Green parties. In terms then of the sort of the nature of this, I think it provides an interesting kind of conundrum for international capital. Obviously, there's huge concerns and huge growing pressure about how about investment, particularly in the environmentally sensitive kind of industries. However, there's still significant economic opportunities, which brings us to the case of Brazil, where the Amazon and the potential to open it up. Obviously, President Bolsonaro stood on a platform in 2018 in part on the basis that he would take steps to improve this and give increased opportunities for mining companies, oil and gas exploration, but crucially also for the agricultural industry, who is heavily supportive of him. And again, this really highlights the sort of paradox of you have a government in an emerging market who would likely encourage foreign investment into such industries. However, the pressures at home, on major multinationals, and also, not to say that there isn't activism within Brazil as well, shows the difficulties of trying to make a decision about this. Excuse me. So even with a lot of this pressure, which is even telling on Bolsonaro in Brazil, and he's in a fairly weak position in the legislature for pushing through a lot of his more sort of extreme plans about the environment, which is a positive in terms of slowing things down. But even with that being said, 2019 still saw 9,000 square kilometers of Amazon deforested in 2019. So we can see there, that contrast. I think we then think about the risks. I mean, I start off with the reputational side. And this is, not just a LATAM feature, but, globally, we're seeing increased direct action against these companies, increased product boycotts, and particularly calls on social media and criticism very heavily, obviously, on the oil and gas industry, but also a rising risk of shareholder activism, be that one person buying a share to turn up to an AGM and disrupt it, to larger investment and an attempt to influence board's behavior at that level. So then, on the other hand, obviously there's the regulatory risk, which, in line, as I said, with this increased top-down sort of influence on green politics. And I think in terms of forecasting trends, it may not be something for now, but certainly as you have a generation of people coming through to political leadership roles who are more interested and more concerned by these issues, that trend for greater regulation and greater scrutiny of companies and their environmental footprint will clearly grow. So what then, in terms of the key takeaway, I think interesting, for you as people advising on investment, will be a trend, excuse me, for increased demand in sustainable investment and green financial products. Again, you will all, I'm sure, be aware of BlackRock. Its joining of the Climate Action 100 Plus, and also the CEO's letter highlighting how the strategy for the company is focused more on sustainability, and that will be at the heart of their strategy going forward. Question for you is, what does that mean? How do you pitch your offer in that context? Sustainable investment is obviously a hugely varied term, but if someone can get it right early, then that strikes me as a real opportunity. And then I think the other thing to balance it is to say that obviously oil and gas remains a profitable industry, but the question then becomes one of timing, how to advise people in that space. You will have seen the Aramco IPO in Saudi Arabia, which managed to achieve its $1 trillion valuation, although international capital a little less interested, mostly domestic. But that's, to my mind, reflective of two things, I suppose. Firstly, is the sheer profitability of the company, but also on the idea that this is a an asset. There's huge reserves. I suppose the question becomes, if there's an increase in regulation over time, at what point do you get to a position where you have a lot of valuable oil that just has to stay in the ground? And at what point does that investment cease to become valuable? And I think monitoring those kind of trends, and particularly shifts in regulatory pressure, will become increasingly important, just as much as the activism side. So that's it's just to say, I hope this gives you a flavour of the importance of considering the wider geopolitical and security angle in terms of making informed commercial decisions. And also, I think, just to make a final point, which is one we fairly regularly make to clients, that we hear a lot about, perhaps a sort of global retrenchment and perhaps a pulling away from a globalized world. That certainly isn't something that I see, and that these issues, political and security risk, will continue to cut across, national, regional, global markets, and affect. Obviously, I've spoken about a handful of sectors, but it's difficult to say that there's anything that really escapes it. And that's all from me.